Right now, you're listening to the Azeem Digital Asks podcast, the podcast where I, Azeem, talk to some of the top marketers in the industry, find out everything about them, how they got to where they are today, and more importantly, sharing some really useful marketing tips that will help everybody listening to this become better marketers. Stay tuned for another great episode. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Azeem Digital Asks podcast. I have an absolutely brilliant guest with me today, and I think the best way to describe him, I'm literally just going to steal his Twitter bio, which is just all local, all the time. What else is there? The wonderful Mike Blumenthal. Mike, how are you?
I am doing really well. I know that brilliant has a slightly different definition in England than in the United States, so I'm not sure which definition we're using, but I'll accept the compliment. Try to do it graciously.
Good stuff, good stuff. Welcome to the show. As you know, we always start with a bit of an icebreaker before we get you to introduce yourself properly. So, mine for you is that, Mike, if there was a movie that was made of your life, what genre would it be and who would play you?
So this was a really hard question for me because I don't think of my life that way. So I actually spent some time researching this question as I want to do. And I started out by looking for the most boring movies. Came up with 50 Shades of Grey and Gone with the Wind, both of which would be totally inappropriate models for my life. And then I thought, well, maybe if I take the angle of the most boring actor, like who I identified as Kevin Costner, and then looked at some of his movies. The only movie of his that I really liked was Dance with the Wolves. But given that it was positioned as based on a true story, but it was really plagiarized research from two famous wolf researchers in Alaska, I thought that would send the wrong signal. But then I landed, it's Christmas time in America. I landed on the idea of This American Life, this sort of, uh, or the story, Christmas story, small town boy faces adversity, goes up against, powerful forces, thinks of ending things, but in the end, all is good. It's played by Jimmy Stewart, which is, a little too waspy for me, a little too much of a Trumpian vibe in the small town. So I thought it would be something like This American Life or American Life, whatever it's called. A Wonderful Life, it's called, not American Life. I'm sorry. It's A Wonderful Life. But instead of Jimmy Stewart, it would be played. I first thought maybe somebody like Woody Allen, but he's been canceled. So again, probably inappropriate. So then I came up with George Burns, right? I mean, this is a guy who I thought would be a perfect foil for this movie to play me. Walking around with a scar, acting at. I think he played God at 92, right? I mean, I can buy into that sort of image of George Burns in the, sort of the outsider in the small town, finally succeeding. So that's sort of the American sort of, success story, but the outsider.
Nice. That is a very good way to start the show. And just for the listeners' benefit, we have caught up previously, and I'm really looking forward to this episode, really looking forward to learning a lot about you. So, for those listeners who have lived under like a digital rock, do not know who you are, would you like to give them a little bit of a short introduction into everything about Mike?
Sure. So, I started my life as a son of a retail merchant and lived that life, swept the floors instead of getting an allowance, joined that business after uh, I went, I grew up, went to college during the early 70s, a very tumultuous time in the United States with Vietnam. It was a very disturbing time for me. I got arrested a few times, ended up from that sort of taking the complete opposite path. I became a mountaineering guide in East Africa and Wyoming and Alaska, sea kayaking. Spent 10 years sort of mostly away from civilization to largely heal from the sort of pain of the United States and pain of my relationship with my father. Decided in the early 1980s to come back, reconcile with my father on my terms. He was a classic sort of parent of that era. Never could say a good word, never could say I love you. Around the dinner table, love was expressed as last month's P&L values, which always seemed very weird to me. But I did over the next few, 20 years, finally reconcile with him as I worked in his business, created my own business as part of that. which was a computer store. The whole business, we got our asses kicked. We did really well in the 80s, early 90s, till we didn't. And a 10-year sort of slide as Amazon came online and mail order came online and Walmart came online. And we closed the doors in 2001. Very difficult, obviously, 50 employees and 60 years in business was a very painful moment for me. But then, fortunately, I had explored the internet up to that time, and we had built a content management system around some open source software. To me, open source was the most brilliant thing ever because it allowed me to sort of leverage other people's work, but still give them credit and still benefit from it. So we built an open source web development package in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and that became the business I was in, building fairly large websites for not-for-profits within a 50, 60-mile radius of this very rural area where I lived. It became obvious to me that they probably weren't going to do great for the business, but there was a lot of interest in building websites, and it became obvious that the only way they would do well was if I learned search engine optimization, which I did in the early 2000s, followed Danny Sullivan and Search Engine Journal, and followed the creation of Search Engine Land. And around 2005, Google came out with their local business listings. And for me, that was a total epiphany. I was so annoyed at the yellow pages with their, I needed 9 yellow pages to be able to research prospects to get 250,000 people around me. I needed 9 yellow page books. And every year they'd come in and try to upsell me on one more book and one more ad and what my competitors were doing. They were the masters of FUD selling, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I hated them. So when Google brought out my local listings, it was an epiphany for me. It was like, these guys are going to kick the yellow pages butts. And
Yeah.
I started researching Google. They merged with Google Maps 2006. I became friends with Bill Slawski and Matt McGee and Greg Sterling at that time because they were the only people that were looking at local. Started writing a blog about it in 2006, which was a very tactically focused blog. And that I loved local because it was everything that I knew and appreciated about my history, but it was so enmeshed in the future. And so I just became totally engrossed with the battles of the 2007, 2008, Google going up against the Yellow Pages on one side, the MapQuests on the other. Met people like David Mim and Mary Bowling, great people who I became friends with by going to SMX conferences and speaking at those conferences. I still didn't get one job in local during that period, but 2010 we started Local U, which was a digital training. Our idea was to bring low cost, in-person web SEO, local SEO training to the hinterlands because most of these businesses that really needed it couldn't make it to New York City. But starting about 2011, I started getting local jobs nationally, internationally, and by 2012, my time had switched from 80%, 90% web work to 80, 90% local work. During that time, at Local U, I met Don Campbell. He was one of the early people involved in local at one of the Local U's we did, and he and I and Thomas Hash put together Get 5 Stars, which became Gather Up in early 2013. And so local and my pursuit of understanding local has really been the driving force of my both personal friendships and my career opportunities.
Yeah, what an interesting career. Thank you very much for sharing that. And I would urge anybody listening to this, if you haven't had the chance to jump on a quick video call with Mike, you definitely should. Because I remember he showed me, I think it's in your background, you've got like loads of different directory books from
I
every year,
I
pretty
have
much.
right. I've been saving the Yellow Pages books for the last 10 or 12 years, and every year I tabulate how many pages are in it. There was probably in my local book there was probably 250 pages in 2009, and this last one I got was probably 87 pages in the Yellow Page books, but it was done in large print for the benefit of the elderly, which I think are the only people still reading it. So.
Awesome. Thank you very much for sharing. And again, thank you for being so open about your career.
Well, just
I
as a
wanted
side
to
note,
touch.
if they hadn't done it in large print, it'd probably be 50 pages, right?
Nice. I just wanted to touch on like the early parts of your career. So imagine that you could say jump into a time machine now, but armed with all of the knowledge you've got. You can go back to the start of your career. What advice would you give to yourself on day one?
I'm not a great guy for looking back. I always sort of plod forward 1 foot at a time. But one of the things that took me a long time to learn that I probably should have learned quicker, more quickly, was the idea of scaling, right? As an individual who didn't really want to work, who not want to work for somebody else, incapable of working for somebody else, right? The reasons I've started my own businesses is because I am unhirable as an employee. But after our business closed with 50 employees, it was really emotionally very difficult. And so I worked with my brother only, and we each worked on separate projects. So the idea of an individual, but as I got into agency work, I could never, I was very constrained by the lack of the ability to scale that. I didn't want to hire a lot of employees. I started working with subcontractors. I didn't really want to manage subcontractors. It was my resistance to that really got in my way. The idea of scaling what you do and then offloading what you don't like to do. I didn't understand that. If I could have learned that earlier, I could have, I think, been happier earlier.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
And as a note on that, I started helping people with reviews in 2008 and thinking reviews were the most amazing thing, but small businesses had such a hard time dealing with them, right? So I came up with this system, but I couldn't get anybody to follow my system instructions, right? So all these small businesses would hire me, they'd pay me, but then they wouldn't do it. And so when we finally created Get 5 Stars, I did more good for more businesses in the first 6 months than I had done in literally 10 years of independent consulting.
Awesome. What an achievement. That's brilliant. Thanks very much for that. You mentioned earlier on a few names who you started following early on in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
What about now? Who inspires you right now? Who's an inspiration for you?
Well, Bill Slawski continues, who was an inspiration then, continues to be an inspiration again, somebody who puts 1 foot in front of the other, continually learning. David Mim also, Mary has retired to a large extent, so she would have been on my list, but she's retired. But David Mim and Bill Slawski are two that I really follow. Aaron Wyke who joined us at Local U and then subsequently joined with my recommendation at Get 5 Stars, has become one of my just most both favorite people in the world, as well as somebody who I respect more than anybody in terms of their ability to build a business that's not just good but great, that customers love, which I think is so attached to my value. It's not the issue of making money; it's the issue of having people use your product and get pleasure out of that and succeed with it, right? So Aaron Wyke, and then Greg Sterling, who I met early on, but who has been very consistent, persistent, and tried to pursue the area of local with great integrity. I mean, those are the people that I look up to, and I'm also fortunate enough to be friends with.
Awesome. I'm sure they'll be pleased to hear that once this episode goes out. Let's switch tack a little bit then and let's talk about the business. What's the biggest challenge you would say that you've got right now and how are you going to get past that?
So I'm at a point in my life where it doesn't matter to me if I fail anymore. It used to matter a great deal, but I've been able to position myself in such a way that um, failure is just one form of success. Success is one form of success. Just getting by is one form of success. I don't take that as much to heart as I used to. And so I basically look at the challenges and figure that the worst case is I fall flat on my face, and that's not such a bad. I've been there, done it. It was very devastating the time I went through it. But what I learned was that there's life on the other side, and so I view challenges differently these days. I've also learned, and at my point in life, I don't like to be a manager anymore, and so the biggest problem for me is finding people to work with who have the same love and passion that I do for the topics we work on. So I don't view it quite that way anymore, and I have the luxury of not viewing it quite that way. It's quite a relief and a release to not worry about failing. So I don't view business problems quite the same way. It's like you give it your best shot, you bring integrity to it, you ask the questions about, who benefits, who doesn't benefit, and you try to honor your commitment to the people that are paying you, i.e. the customer, to do it in their best interest. And I think as long as you follow that, you'll probably be okay.
Yeah, brilliant. That's a brilliant perspective on it, and I'm sure the listeners will take a lot of value from that, especially the points around failure as well. And speaking of the listeners, for their benefit, I remember when we caught up and had a quick video call, we were spending a lot of time, probably too long maybe, talking about COVID. But in a professional sense, how do you think COVID has affected you professionally, and how have you come back from that?
Well, on a personal level, I'm a bit of an introvert, even though I love to speak and love to get out and share ideas, because I think only through sharing and cooperation can I make advances personally. But COVID has allowed me to spend more time studying, spend more time gardening, spend more time with my wife. We had a rip roaring game of code names last night. Uh, spend more time on my bike, spend more time exercising. So personally, despite the risks that everybody's facing, it's been good. Professionally, there were some challenges early on with Gather Up in terms of we were very worried about whether our product would still be needed in this time, and uh, there was the big pause, but we recovered from that quite nicely, and we've started growing again, so we overcame that. But then I see all the small businesses, and that's painful for me because they are facing an existential crisis like never before. And we live in a country in which big business is honored by policy and small businesses largely ignored by policy. So the headwinds that small businesses were confronting prior to COVID have only become stronger. And there's very little national and state support for small business to be a vehicle for wealth creation. And so people that have the courage to do it are confronting very difficult times. So that's, sad to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not too much different over here as we discussed previously. You mentioned in your answer there about having time to learn, and I wanted to just touch on that a little bit. So how are you learning? What do you do to learn? How do you sort of top up your knowledge of everything that's going on in the industry?
I follow a few people and see what's going on with them. But the best learning for me is to deep dive into some local question and explore it for as long as it takes to explore it. So this spring, I did a deep dive into the sentiment in COVID reviews that were coming in for the major businesses that were considered essential and stayed open during the peak of the COVID crisis. So places like Walmart and home repair businesses and those sorts of businesses, Costco. And I was able to analyze how they effectively, through the reviews, how consumers communicated their appreciation or lack thereof. Virtually every business lost some ratings during the COVID period. Employees were stressed, consumers were stressed, but the better businesses rebounded very quickly, and some of them just managed to shoot themselves in their foot. And that was all obvious through analyzing reviews at scale through the sentiment analysis and the tools that Gather Up brought to me. So I was able to use the tool we created to analyze this. So just by taking a deep dive and looking at it, it was amazing to see how you could, and you also could see the political friction in our country around COVID and reviews and how it showed up in so many of these reviews.
Yeah, awesome. That sounds really, really interesting. Thank you very much for sharing that. Just going to sidestep a minute, and then obviously everybody knows you're an expert in local.
Yeah, just a note on the word expert for everybody who's listening. It means that I'm heads down, look at Google Maps way too much, spend way too much time. Fortunately, I have a current employer who allows me to do that. And I'm 5 minutes ahead of of anybody else. And I'm probably 10 minutes behind somebody like Joe Hawkins, who has really taken on the mantle of Google My Business sort of sensei, right? She's really become uh, really excellent at it. So uh, expertise is a fleeting moment in time.
Awesome. Right, I'm going to put you on the spot now.
Okay.
What do you think is the biggest mistake that people make when it comes to local?
Oh, I think it's probably looking for silver bullets when the basics are still really the primary drivers of local. The local algorithm, which came out in 2006, and patents were released in 2008, which I wrote about in that time frame. I went back and unearthed 10 elements of the local search algorithm, and those are still the 10 elements that are important today. And I think that people think that somehow they haven't done those things well, and yet they're looking for some silver bullet, some that will change the outcome. And so to me, it's a clear understanding of the logic of the system in which you're engaging, maximizing those things that benefit you the most. We've got all that done, tweaking around the edges, monitoring, measuring, but not worrying and not thinking there's a silver bullet.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much for sharing that. It's really, really interesting. So, sadly, we're coming to the end of the show, and also we're coming to the end of the year, more importantly. And what a strange year it has been. As the year is coming to a close, what's in your in tray, figuratively? What are you working on right now before 2020 ends?
I am working on a couple new business ideas with people I really like. Sort of, my plan is to probably cut back a little bit at Gather Up, and then to work on a few new business ideas. So I'm working on two, or I guess three business ideas at the moment to both in an effort to create value for both the people that work there and for the customer. Um, so stay tuned. Oh, more will be, I'll be making more clear my path, but right now I've got two or three things I'm working on that are all very interesting to me.
Nice. And then this part of the podcast, as always in every episode, is essentially like a sounding board for you. So I always say that if we were to swap roles right now, you could be the interviewer. What question would you have asked yourself that I haven't? What would you like to talk about that you've not talked about already?
Why, as a culture, and in SEO and local SEO, do we need quote unquote superstars? To
Ooh,
me, everybody, if they put the time and effort in, can be really knowledgeable in the field, can communicate that to others, can help others. And there isn't anything that really distinguishes those people that have been so identified from those that are just slogging in the trenches every day. So it really is a question of why, as a culture and as a business, local and SEO does that all the time.
yeah, that's a really, really interesting point, and I couldn't agree with you more. Sometimes you will unearth really valuable nuggets of information from somebody who has been in the industry for a couple of years versus somebody who's been in the industry for 5, 6, or longer years. So, yeah, completely agree with you there. I always ask my guests right before they go, should you listen to music while working? What song, artist, playlist gets you in the mood or gets you like super productive? And if you don't listen to music, how do you get yourself into that super productive mode?
So I don't listen to music at work. I find it very distracting. It detracts from my concentration. I am a big fan of Americana, particularly the likes of Willie Nelson, John Prine, uh, folk music from the '60s, singer songwriters. But the one of the things that's very focusing for me is the deadline of a talk. If I have a talk coming up, I don't like to do the same talk. I very rarely do the same presentation twice. And so that's very focusing. The other is coming upon a great question. I love questions, and I love to questions that I can answer with the tools at hand. That's very focusing for me. If I can come up with a great question and explore that from the angles, that really gets me up in the morning, keeps me going through the day, and allows me to focus. But the reality is we all go through phases. And for me, I am a bit of a winter bear by this, in the sense that winter comes, I sort of hunker down. Some might call it seasonal affective disorder. I just call it recharging. So right now I'm in a recharging pattern, waiting
Yeah.
for the sunshine to come back, waiting for life to return to spring. And over the winter, I just spend my time thinking, and that gets me charged up for the next year.
Awesome. What a very interesting answer. Thank you very much for sharing that.
And I would ask you, you didn't, what does that for you?
For me, it's quite strange to be honest because I listen to like classical piano music, so it doesn't have lyrics. I don't listen to music with lyrics
Mm-hmm.
because I'll find myself getting mentally distracted. But
Mm.
I've tried listening to podcasts whilst doing some really intensive work in spreadsheets and everything else, but I just can't do it because I get too involved in the conversation rather than my actual work.
Or vice versa, you get too involved in the work and you can't hear the conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So for me, just very easy on the ears, like classical piano music, just so there's some sort of noise in the background. But in
Interesting.
fact, one of my previous guests has mentioned there's a website called Coffeetivity, which is just basically like the sounds of a coffee shop in the background, which I've tried working to before, and it's definitely interesting because you do feel like you're in a coffee shop. So I definitely recommend that.
Problem with
That's
that, the
brilliant.
sounds of that, though, as opposed to beautiful classical piano, would be the jarring discontinuity of it, which would be distracting to me. I mean, I work in a small office, as you saw. It's 20 by 20 with nobody else around. It's very quiet. So to me, quiet is the order of the day. Um, and that's how I, would prefer it. But it's interesting. You listen to classical piano. I'll
Yeah.
have to try that.
Never outside of work, I will add, but just during work
Mm-hmm.
time, yeah. I just need something in my ears. But yeah, awesome. Speaking of that, actually, a bit of tips that we just shared with each other then. If there was one like quick fire marketing tip that you can share with the listeners that might help them to do their jobs better, what would that be?
Well, in local, to me, leaning into what Google is doing is a critical aspect of it. That while Google, quote unquote, or as Rand Fishkin would say, is stealing traffic from your website, from where I sit, that may be a problem, but it's a problem that you can prepare for, lean into, and do well. So to me, the tip would be to lean into what Google is doing as long as it's leading to solid, low cost leads. And when it stops, then, have a backup plan to do something else, right? So that leaning into Google means great photography, reviews around the web, not just reviews at Google. It means, thinking about Google as a transaction environment, thinking about Google as a visual search engine. Those are all things that Google is doing and doing to keep users on their site, but they're doing it in a way that still provides a lot of opportunity for lead generation and exposure for the clients you're working with.
Just before you do go though, how can people find out more about you? Where can they get in touch with you? Where can they find you on social media, etc., etc.?
Sure.
Share your details.
So on social media, I'm primarily on Twitter, M Blumenthal. At Twitter. My email is an open email, mike@gatherup.com. You're welcome to email me. Those are the two primary places. I write at the GatherUp blog and at blumenthals.com/blog. And occasionally, and at Local U, I do a weekly podcast on notable events in local for the past week at Local U. So those are the ways you can see what I'm doing, get in touch with me if you have a question, and I'm more than willing to listen to your question and answer it if I can.
Mike, thank you very much for being a brilliant guest. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. As I always do, I give the guests the last word. So the last word on this show is all yours. Go
Well,
for it.
thank you for being a brilliant host, Azeem. I really, Frank, thank you for giving me an opportunity, and thank you for, running such a great series and interview. I really appreciate it.
So that was another great episode in the bag. I'm really enjoying hearing from some brilliant people in this industry. If you enjoyed this podcast, please follow me on Spotify. Please leave a rating on Apple Podcasts or whichever platform you are using. Tell a friend to tell a friend, and hopefully see you for the next episode.